house was full in those first days. Family and friends came quietly, one after another, bringing warmth, smiles, and the kind of affection people reserve for something new and precious. They leaned in close. They whispered how beautiful he was. They held him carefully, as if love alone could keep him safe. Emily stood nearby, watching it all. At the time, nothing felt wrong. These were gestures she had seen her whole life. The way people welcomed a newborn. The way love was shown without hesitation. She didn't know then that some of those moments would return to her later, not as memories of comfort, but as questions she would replay in silence. Not because anyone meant harm, not because anyone broke a rule, but because love, when given without boundaries, can sometimes ask a price no one expects. This is the story of how Emily learned that protecting her child didn't mean loving less. It meant learning when to step back. Emily Carter entered pregnancy the way she approached most new responsibilities in her life, carefully, deliberately, and with quiet determination. This was her first child, and she felt the weight of that fact in everything she did. She read books recommended by doctors and other mothers. She bookmarked articles, highlighted paragraphs, and made small notes in the margins. She learned which foods to avoid, how much sleep she should get, and which symptoms were considered normal at each stage. Every appointment went into her calendar, every test result into a folder she kept neatly organized at home. Emily believed that preparation was a form of love. If she paid enough attention, if she followed the guidance closely enough, she could protect what was growing inside her. Daniel Carter was different, though not careless. He trusted systems more than details. To him, modern medicine had already answered most of the questions they needed to ask. Doctors knew what they were doing. Guidelines existed for a reason. As long as they showed up, listened, and followed instructions, things would work out. He admired Emily's dedication, but he didn't share her constant vigilance. When she worried about small aches or fleeting discomforts, he reminded her that pregnancy was not an illness. When she questioned whether she was doing enough, he reassured her that millions of women had done this before her. Between them, they found balance. Their home slowly adjusted to the idea of a child. Furniture shifted. A small room that once held boxes and unused items became something else entirely. Emily washed tiny clothes and folded them with care, even though they wouldn't be needed for months. Daniel assembled furniture in quiet concentration, checking instructions twice, making sure everything was stable and secure. They talked about the future in practical terms: schedules, work leave, sleep, or the lack of it. They imagined exhaustion, but also joy. They imagined that once the baby arrived, instincts would take over, that love would guide them. Doctors often reminded them that the first weeks after birth were sensitive, that newborns required extra care. Emily listened closely to those words, storing them away without fully understanding what they might one day mean. Daniel heard them too, but they sounded more like general caution than something personal. At night, Emily sometimes rested her hands on her growing stomach, feeling the subtle movements beneath her skin. Those moments filled her with a quiet confidence. Her body knew what to do. The world, she believed, was ready to support them. They trusted that the hardest part was the waiting, that once the pregnancy was over, once their baby was finally in their arms, everything else would fall into place naturally. Preparation would turn into routine. Worry would soften into familiarity. They didn't yet know how much there was to learn beyond those months of waiting. Noah Carter was born on a quiet morning in a small local hospital, just as winter was beginning to soften into early spring. The labor was long but uncomplicated. Emily followed instructions the same way she had followed every guideline during pregnancy: focused, steady, trusting the process. Daniel stayed close, grounding himself in the familiar rhythms of the room, the monitors, the measured voices of nurses, the sense that everything was unfolding as expected. When Noah finally arrived, the world seemed to narrow to a single moment. He cried immediately, a sharp, unmistakable sound that filled the room and confirmed what everyone had been waiting to hear. The doctors said he was healthy, strong lungs, good color, normal reflexes, all the words new parents hope for, delivered calmly, without urgency. Emily held him for the first time and felt something shift inside her. He was warm and impossibly light, his body resting against her chest as if he had always belonged there. His skin was soft in a way she hadn't imagined, thinner and more delicate than anything she had ever touched. Every movement felt intentional, every breath something to be protected. This was not the abstract idea of a baby she had prepared for over months. This was real, fragile, entirely dependent. Daniel watched quietly from her side. He noticed how Emily's posture changed, how her arms curved instinctively, as if forming a barrier between Noah and everything else in the room. He felt it too, the sudden clarity that responsibility was no longer theoretical. Later, as nurses moved in and out and paperwork replaced urgency, the doctor spoke to them about the days ahead. The tone was reassuring but precise. Newborns, they explained, were still adjusting to the world. Their systems were immature. The first few weeks required special care. Emily listened carefully, just as she always did. She nodded, storing the information alongside everything else she had learned. The words sounded important but distant, like a precaution meant for other families, other circumstances. Noah slept most of that first day. Emily watched him constantly, memorizing the rise and fall of his chest, the way his fingers curled without effort. Every small movement felt significant. She counted breaths without realizing she was doing it. Daniel noticed her vigilance and gently reminded her that rest mattered too. The doctors had said Noah was doing well. There was no reason to worry. They were still inside the safety of the hospital, surrounded by professionals. And Emily believed that. She trusted the environment, the protocols, the careful order of it all. This was what preparation had led to. This was the moment where everything she had learned would begin to apply naturally. When they were discharged and sent home with instructions and pamphlets, Emily read every word again. Feeding schedules, sleep patterns, signs to watch for. The information felt manageable, familiar. As they carried Noah out of the hospital, wrapped tightly against the cool air, Emily felt a growing certainty settle into her chest. Love, she thought, would be enough to guide them. She did not yet understand how much that love would soon ask of her. The first visitors came only a few days after Emily and Daniel brought Noah home. It felt natural, expected. In the way American families often gather around a newborn, bringing food, quiet excitement, and a sense of shared celebration. The house, which had felt carefully prepared and almost still during pregnancy, filled with movement and soft noise. Coats were placed over chairs. Voices stayed low, instinctively respectful of the sleeping baby. People leaned in close to admire Noah, marveling at how small he was, how peaceful. Noah was passed gently from one set of arms to another. Each person held him carefully, as if aware of his fragility, yet eager to feel that closeness for themselves. There were whispered compliments, affectionate smiles, and moments where faces hovered just inches away. A few leaned down and left quick kisses on his forehead, on his cheek, light, fleeting gestures that lasted no more than a second. They were the kind of gestures no one questioned. Almost automatic. The kind that had been repeated across generations, carried forward without much thought. Emily noticed. She stood nearby, watching the scene unfold. At first, she felt only warmth. This was what community looked like. This was love, expressed openly. Then a brief hesitation surfaced. It was nothing dramatic, just a passing thought, barely formed. Should I say something? Is this okay? The thought lingered for a moment longer than she expected, but the room was calm. Noah was quiet in their arms. Everyone looked happy, careful, well-intentioned. Emily didn't want to disrupt that. She told herself that these were family and close friends, people who loved Noah, who would never knowingly harm him. She reasoned that if there were a real danger, she would have been warned more clearly, that she was probably overthinking, letting new mother anxiety take hold. So she stayed silent. Daniel stood close by, observing with a different lens. He saw connection forming, bonds being created. To him, the closeness felt reassuring, proof that Noah was surrounded by care and support. There was no sense of threat in the room, only familiarity. The visits continued over the next few days. Each one followed a similar rhythm. Gentle excitement, careful handling. Brief moments of closeness that no one thought twice about. When the house finally returned to quiet, Emily and Daniel felt relieved but content. Noah slept peacefully in his crib. The visits had gone well. Nothing felt out of place. That evening, Emily moved through the house slowly, tidying up small reminders of company, cups on the counter, folded blankets, a vase of flowers left behind. She paused once near Noah's crib, watching him sleep. The moment of hesitation from earlier crossed her mind again, faint and indistinct. It didn't linger. There was nothing concrete to attach it to, no reason to feel uneasy. The day closed the way it had begun, calm, ordinary, unremarkable. None of them knew that those brief moments of closeness would return later, not as memories of warmth, but as questions Emily would quietly ask herself again and again. The first changes were easy to miss. They didn't arrive all at once, and they didn't announce themselves with urgency. They settled quietly into the rhythm of the days, subtle enough to be explained away, gentle enough to feel temporary. Noah began to feed a little less than before, not refusing entirely, not crying in protest. He would latch on, nurse briefly, then pull away sooner than usual, his small mouth relaxing as if he had simply lost interest. Emily noticed the shift immediately. She adjusted his position, tried again, waited a moment longer. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. She told herself it was normal. Newborns changed quickly. Their patterns were unpredictable. She had read that. Then there was the sleep. Noah slept longer stretches, deeper ones. At first, Emily welcomed it. Sleep meant rest. Sleep meant growth. But soon the quiet began to feel different. The house felt too still. She found herself standing near his crib, watching his chest rise and fall, counting breaths without intending to. Occasionally he fussed, not sharp cries, not the kind that demanded immediate attention, just soft, unsettled sounds, brief expressions of discomfort that faded as quickly as they came. Emily picked him up, rocked him, and felt him relax against her shoulder. His skin remained warm, but not hot. His color stayed healthy. There was no clear fever, no visible sign that something was wrong. Daniel watched Emily move through these moments with growing attentiveness. He saw her pause more often. He noticed how frequently she checked the clock, the baby monitor, the temperature. When she mentioned her concerns, he listened, then offered calm explanations. Growth spurts, digestive discomfort, normal adjustment. Emily wanted to believe that. She gathered the signs together in her mind, acknowledged them, and then set them aside. Not out of neglect, but out of reason. This was what preparation was for, to know when not to panic. Still, a quiet unease lingered. A few days later, something new appeared. Emily noticed it while changing Noah's clothes in the afternoon light. Tiny spots near the corner of his mouth. Small and clear, clustered so closely they almost blended into one another. They were easy to overlook, easy to mistake for irritation or dryness. By the next morning, some of them were gone. Others had returned. One had broken, leaving behind a faint crust that disappeared within hours. Emily searched her memory. Diaper rash, milk residue, skin sensitivity. She considered all the reasonable explanations and settled on the least concerning one. She switched detergents, changed wipes, watched closely. Then there were his eyes, occasionally red, slightly watery, sensitive to light in a way Emily hadn't noticed before. She adjusted the curtains, dimmed the room, and told herself it was nothing more than fatigue. Noah continued to breathe evenly. He rested quietly in her arms. There was no single moment that demanded action. Daniel remained steady. He didn't dismiss Emily's concerns, but he didn't share her growing uncertainty. Each symptom, taken alone, seemed mild, temporary, not enough to justify alarm. Emily felt herself hovering at a threshold she couldn't quite name. Something was different, but not different enough. Then came the night that changed that balance. Noah grew restless as the evening wore on. His body felt warmer than usual, then cooler, as if unable to settle. Emily wrapped him in another blanket, then removed it, uncertain which choice was right. His breathing quickened. His belly seemed distended, tight beneath her hand. His skin lost some of its color, shifting from soft pink to something paler, less familiar. Emily no longer tried to explain it. She no longer weighed possibilities. She picked him up and felt the weight of him in her arms, heavier somehow, more fragile at the same time. Daniel saw the look on her face and didn't argue. They moved quickly, but not in panic. The drive to the hospital felt both rushed and endless. Streetlights blurred past. Noah remained quiet, too quiet, his small body pressed against Emily's chest as if seeking warmth or comfort he couldn't articulate. At the hospital, everything accelerated. Bright lights replaced the dim calm of their home. Noah was laid gently beneath them, his tiny limbs exposed as wires and monitors were attached. Numbers flickered across screens Emily didn't understand. He seemed distant, his movement slowed, his reflexes weaker. Then his body stiffened. The seizure was brief, subtle enough that Emily almost questioned whether it had happened at all. But the room changed immediately. The air shifted. The calm efficiency of the staff sharpened into focus. Words like infection and bloodstream surfaced. Possibilities were named carefully, without dramatics. The risk of spread, the concern for neurological involvement. Emily stood still. It felt as though the floor beneath her had dropped away, leaving her suspended in a space she hadn't known existed. She listened, but the words arrived slowly, as if filtered through water. No one shouted. No one panicked. Decisions were made quickly, quietly. Treatments prepared, monitoring intensified. Daniel stayed close, grounding himself in action, in presence. Emily watched Noah's chest rise and fall beneath the harsh light and understood, with a clarity that left no room for denial, how narrow the margin had been. The signs had been there. They just hadn't seemed dangerous. As the night stretched on, Emily replayed the past days in her mind, not with blame, but with recognition. Each small change, each moment of hesitation, each time she had chosen calm over caution. She realized then how easily serious things could hide behind ordinary explanations, and how quickly the ordinary could give way to something else entirely. In the quiet hum of the hospital room, with Noah surrounded by machines and measured movements, Emily understood that love alone was not always enough. Sometimes it had to be decisive, And sometimes that understanding came only after the moment to act had already passed. The explanation came quietly. There was no dramatic announcement, no sudden shift in tone meant to frighten them. The doctor spoke in the same measured way Emily had come to associate with competence: clear, careful, restrained. Some viruses, they explained, were far more dangerous to newborns than to adults. One of them was the herpes simplex virus. It was common, widespread, something many people carried for years without knowing it. Sometimes it showed itself as a small cold sore near the mouth. Sometimes it didn't show itself at all. For adults, it was rarely serious. Their immune systems recognized it, knew how to respond, had learned its patterns long ago. For newborns, it was different. Their immune systems were still forming, still learning what belonged and what didn't. What an adult body could contain without effort, a newborn's body might struggle to fight. The doctor explained that transmission didn't always come from obvious illness. It could happen through very close contact, through saliva, breath, the kinds of affectionate gestures families rarely questioned. Kissing, holding someone close, speaking softly just inches away. Emily listened. She nodded at the right moments. She absorbed the words as information, as fact, and yet her mind drifted. It moved backward, quietly, returning to a moment that had felt ordinary at the time. The living room, filled with people, coats draped over chairs, voices overlapping in low conversation, laughter restrained but present. Noah passed carefully from one set of arms to another, his small body cradled, admired, celebrated. Faces had leaned in close. There had been smiles, whispers, warmth, and there had been quick kisses on his forehead, on his cheek, so brief they barely registered, so natural that no one paused to consider them. Emily saw it again now, not as a single image, but as a series of small, ordinary moments strung together. She remembered standing nearby, watching. She remembered the hesitation, a thought that surfaced and faded almost immediately. Should I say something? Is this okay? She remembered dismissing it just as quickly. It had felt unnecessary to intervene. Excessive. She hadn't wanted to create discomfort or awkwardness. She had trusted that love, expressed gently, couldn't be harmful. She remembered telling herself that these were people who cared, people who meant well, that nothing about the moment felt threatening. She didn't remember who had done it, and now she realized she didn't want to. It wasn't important. The doctor continued speaking, outlining the next steps. Treatment, monitoring, caution. The emphasis was on what could be done now, not on tracing the exact source. That, too, felt intentional. Emily understood why. What mattered was that Noah lay here now, surrounded by wires and soft mechanical sounds, his small body working harder than it should have to. What mattered was that something had reached him when he was too small to defend himself. And what mattered most, what settled slowly and unmistakably in Emily's chest, was the understanding that she had been there. She had seen the moment when a boundary might have been set, and she hadn't set it. The realization did not arrive with anger. There was no surge of blame, no instinct to point outward. Emily didn't feel resentment toward her family or friends. She knew they hadn't intended harm. She knew that, if asked, they would have stopped immediately. What she felt instead was quieter, heavier, a recognition that responsibility sometimes came not from action, but from inaction, from the things left unsaid because they felt uncomfortable or unnecessary at the time. She thought of how carefully she had prepared during pregnancy, how diligently she had followed instructions, read guidelines, trusted systems. She had believed that doing things right meant following advice and avoiding obvious risks. She hadn't yet understood how much of protection depended on judgment in the moment, on choosing discomfort over silence. The doctor reminded them that the priority was Noah's recovery, that many cases improved with early treatment and close observation. That outcomes depended on vigilance now, not on revisiting the past. Emily nodded. She appreciated that the focus remained forward-facing, practical, grounded. Still, something fundamental had shifted inside her. She felt it in the way she stood closer to Noah's bed, in the way her awareness sharpened, not with fear, but with clarity. She saw now how easily ordinary affection could cross into risk when directed at someone so small. How love, without boundaries, could become careless without anyone meaning it to. As the hours passed, Emily sat beside Noah and watched him breathe. She no longer replayed the memory with regret. She replayed it with understanding. She understood that being a parent meant more than providing comfort. It meant deciding when closeness was safe and when it wasn't. It meant speaking up, even when the words felt awkward. It meant protecting someone who could not protect himself, not only from obvious dangers, but from the subtle ones that hid inside familiar gestures. By the time the doctor returned with updates and plans for continued monitoring, Emily felt steady again. Not because the situation was resolved, but because she knew, with a certainty she hadn't possessed before, what her role required of her now. She leaned forward slightly and nodded once more. This time, the gesture carried weight. Inside her, a boundary had been drawn. Not out of fear, but out of responsibility. And it would not be crossed again. The hospital settled into a rhythm that felt both steady and endless. Noah remained under close observation, his small body surrounded by quiet machines and soft lights that never dimmed completely. Nurses came and went at regular intervals. Numbers were checked, notes were made, movements were precise and practiced, designed to reassure without promising anything. Time moved differently here. Hours stretched without clear markers. Daylight faded and returned through narrow windows. Emily learned to measure time not by clocks, but by Noah's breathing, by the subtle changes in his color, by the way his body responded, or didn't. There were no dramatic turns, no sudden alarms, no moments of relief large enough to feel final. Instead, there was waiting. Emily sat beside the bed for long stretches, her presence quiet and constant. She watched Noah sleep, watched his chest rise and fall, and tried to memorize the normal patterns of it. Every small movement felt significant. Every still moment carried weight. Daniel stayed close, though he moved more. He paced the hallway, spoke softly with doctors, took phone calls outside the room and returned with careful expressions, filtering information before it reached Emily. He brought water, adjusted chairs, handled the practical details that kept the world functioning around them. They did not talk much about fear. It was there but unspoken. Instead, they spoke in fragments, about meals they hadn't finished, about messages they needed to return, about the logistics of being here for as long as necessary. It was easier to focus on what could be managed. In the quiet moments, Emily found herself thinking differently. She no longer replayed the past with urgency. That work had been done. What remained was the present, the responsibility of now. She noticed how carefully the nurses handled Noah, how each movement was deliberate, how boundaries were assumed, not explained. No one leaned too close. No. Unnecessary contact occurred. Care was expressed through distance as much as touch. It struck her how natural it felt here. Protection was not emotional. It was procedural, intentional. Emily began to understand that this was another language of love. Daniel noticed the change in her, too. She spoke less, but with more clarity. When doctors explained the next steps, she listened with focused attention, no longer overwhelmed by the weight of information. She asked questions, not out of anxiety, but out of responsibility. They both began to accept a truth that had been uncomfortable before. Noah was fragile, not weak, but vulnerable in ways that required constant awareness. That understanding did not diminish their love. It sharpened it. The days passed without resolution. There were small improvements that could not yet be called progress. Stable readings, slight responses, enough to keep hope present, but restrained. Emily learned to sit with that balance. She learned that patience was not passive. It was an active choice to stay, to observe, to wait without forcing answers. At night, when the hospital grew quieter, she noticed how alert she remained. Not tense, but aware. She felt different from the woman who had stood in her living room weeks ago, hesitant to interrupt a moment of warmth. That hesitation felt distant now. She understood that protecting Noah would require her to speak clearly, even when it felt uncomfortable, to set limits, even when they disrupted expectations, to choose his safety over social ease. Daniel came to the same realization in his own way. He had trusted systems, guidelines, and the idea that love naturally led to good outcomes. Now he saw how much depended on judgment within moments, on decisions that had no manual. He watched Emily and saw strength in her quiet resolve. He recognized it in himself, too, in the way he now evaluated situations with greater caution, greater care. They were not afraid of the world, but they were no longer naive about it. Eventually, the doctor spoke of cautious optimism, of continued observation, of steps forward that would take time. Emily received the words with steady composure. She did not rush toward relief. She understood now that recovery was a process, not an event. As she sat beside Noah, she placed her hand near him, not on him, close enough to feel connected, far enough to respect the care he needed. It felt right. She realized then that love was changing shape. It was becoming quieter, more deliberate, less instinctive, more considered, and she welcomed that change. Because loving Noah did not mean surrounding him with constant closeness. It meant learning when closeness was safe and when distance was necessary. In the stillness of the hospital room, Emily felt a calm she hadn't expected. Not because the uncertainty had disappeared, but because she knew now how to meet it. With patience, with awareness, and with the courage to protect, even when protection required restraint. Noah came home on a quiet afternoon. There was no celebration waiting at the door, no rush of visitors, no sense of returning to something unfinished. Emily and Daniel carried him inside carefully, the way they had learned to do, slowly, deliberately, aware of every small movement. The house felt different now. It was the same space they had left days earlier, but the silence carried a new meaning. Not emptiness, but intention. Everything had been cleaned, arranged, simplified. There were fewer objects within reach, fewer distractions. The environment felt calmer, designed to protect rather than impress. Emily placed Noah in his crib and stood back for a moment, watching. His breathing was steady. His color had returned. He looked like himself again, not the fragile figure beneath hospital lights, but the baby she had carried home weeks ago, now marked by experience she knew he would never remember. She felt relief, but it was quiet. Not the kind that rushes in all at once, but the kind that settles slowly, layer by layer, until it becomes part of how you breathe. Daniel moved through the house with the same careful awareness. He checked windows, adjusted lighting, kept noise low. He had always been attentive, but now his actions carried an added layer of purpose. They spoke briefly about what would come next. Family and friends would want to visit again. Messages had already arrived, offers of help, expressions of concern, gentle curiosity about Noah's condition. The support was genuine. The affection was still there. What had changed was how Emily and Daniel would receive it. They agreed, without much discussion, that things would be different. When the first visit was arranged, Emily felt the familiar tension rise. Not fear, but awareness. She prepared the space carefully. Chairs placed at a distance. Hand sanitizer visible, not as a suggestion, but as an expectation. When people arrived, they were welcomed warmly. Emily smiled. She thanked them for coming. She explained calmly and clearly what Noah needed now. There was no apology in her tone, no hesitation, just information, offered with kindness and certainty. Some nodded immediately, some asked questions. A few looked surprised, but everyone listened. Noah remained in his crib, sleeping peacefully. There were no hands reaching out without permission, no instinctive leaning in. The room adjusted itself around the boundaries that had been set. Emily noticed how natural it felt. The discomfort she had once feared never arrived. What replaced it was something steadier, a sense of alignment between what she felt and what she did. Daniel stood beside her, supporting the choices with his presence. When conversations drifted toward old habits, he gently redirected them. Not defensively, not forcefully, just firmly enough to hold the line. The visits ended quietly. There was no tension lingering in the air, no sense of loss. The warmth remained, reshaped, but intact. Later that evening, Emily sat beside Noah and reflected on how much had changed in a matter of weeks. She thought about the woman she had been during pregnancy, prepared, attentive, trusting. She thought about the new mother she had become, loving, instinctive, uncertain. And she thought about who she was now. She understood that love was not diminished by boundaries. It was defined by them. Protecting Noah did not require withdrawing from others. It required clarity, honesty, the willingness to prioritize safety over expectation. Emily realized that this understanding would not apply only to infancy. There would be other moments in the years ahead when saying no would feel difficult, when protecting would mean disappointing, when love would require restraint rather than closeness. She felt ready for those moments now. Daniel shared that understanding in his own way. He had always believed in systems, in guidance, in the idea that doing the right thing meant following established paths. Now he saw how much of parenting lived outside instruction manuals. It lived in decisions made quietly, in boundaries set early, in choosing awareness over assumption. As the days passed, life found a new rhythm. Noah grew stronger. Feedings became more consistent. Sleep settled into gentle patterns. The house filled with small sounds again. Soft movements, quiet routines, the ordinary markers of daily life returning. Emily no longer watched him with constant vigilance. She watched him with confidence. Not because she believed nothing could go wrong, but because she trusted her ability to respond when it did. One afternoon, sunlight filtered through the window as Emily stood near the crib. She didn't reach in right away. She observed, smiled, and waited. It was a small moment, unremarkable to anyone else, but to Emily, it felt complete. She had learned that loving a newborn did not mean surrounding them with constant closeness. It meant understanding when closeness helped and when it harmed. It meant recognizing that safety could be an expression of care, that distance chosen thoughtfully could be an act of devotion. As Emily and Daniel moved forward together, they carried this understanding with them, not as fear, but as wisdom. Their family was quieter now, more intentional, more grounded. And in that calm, they found a deeper form of love, one that protected not by holding tighter, but by knowing when to step back.